Boys laughed at new girl eating fries alone. 30 seconds later, they were taken down in front of Cafeteria. The morning mist hung low over Westfield Academy's sprawling campus as Elena Martinez adjusted her backpack straps and navigated through the crowds of students flowing toward the main building. She'd been at this prestigious private school for exactly 4 days, long enough to understand its unwritten rules, but not long enough to find her place within them. The Gothic architecture loomed overhead, all stone arches and ivy-covered walls that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inspire. In the main courtyard, she noticed how students naturally separated into distinct groups, each claiming their territory with practiced ease. Athletes dominated the central benches, their letterman jackets like armor against the morning chill. Academic achievers clustered near the library entrance, their conversations peppered with references to AP courses and college applications. Artists and musicians occupied the shaded areas beneath ancient oak trees, their colorful clothing a deliberate contrast to the school's conservative dress code. Elena belonged to none of these groups. She was a scholarship student, admitted based on exceptional test scores and a compelling essay about overcoming adversity. What the admissions committee didn't know was that her essay barely scratched the surface of her actual experiences. Her mother had been a police detective who'd spent years teaching Elena not just how to observe, but how to truly see. Before cancer took her 2 years ago, Detective Maria Martinez had instilled in her daughter skills that went far beyond academic excellence. The cafeteria at Westfield Academy was an architectural marvel, with soaring ceilings supported by dark wooden beams and tall windows that flooded the space with natural light. Round tables dotted the main floor, while rectangular ones lined the walls, creating natural hierarchies based on location and visibility. Elena had quickly learned that the center tables were reserved for those at the apex of the social pyramid, while the periphery housed everyone else in descending order of importance. She'd chosen a table near the far wall, partially hidden behind a decorative pillar that offered both privacy and a clear view of the entire room. Her lunch was simple compared to the gourmet offerings from the school's kitchen that most students enjoyed. A turkey sandwich she'd made that morning, an apple, a bag of pretzels, and a water bottle. She'd learned to be self-sufficient early, a necessity when your father worked double shifts as a paramedic to afford even partial tuition at a school like Westfield. Opening her worn copy of The Art of War by Sun Tzu, Elena settled into her routine of eating while reading. The book had been her mother's, its margins filled with handwritten notes comparing ancient military strategy to modern law enforcement tactics. These annotations were more precious to Elena than the text itself, each one a conversation with a mother she could no longer speak to directly. 3 tables away, Cameron Ashford held court with his usual ensemble of followers. At 17, he possessed the kind of casual perfection that money and genetics conspired to create. His blonde hair was artfully tousled, his uniform modified just enough to show personality without violating dress code, his smile practiced to convey both charm and subtle menace. As heir to the Ashford pharmaceutical fortune and son of the school board president, he operated with the assumption that rules were suggestions and consequences were for other people. "Check out the scholarship girl," Cameron said, his voice carrying just far enough to ensure surrounding tables could hear. 4 days, and she hasn't tried to talk to anyone. You'd think someone in her position would be trying harder to fit in. His closest friend, Derek Huang, glanced over with mild interest. Derek came from new tech money, his family having sold their startup for 9 figures the previous year. "Maybe she's just shy," he offered, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care either way. "Shy?" Cameron's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Or maybe she thinks she's too good for us, sitting there with her homemade lunch and her library book like she's some kind of intellectual." The third member of their group, Marcus Thompson, shifted uncomfortably. Unlike the others, Marcus's position in the social hierarchy came from athletic prowess rather than family wealth. His basketball skills had earned him a place at Cameron's table, but he'd never quite gotten comfortable with the casual cruelty that seemed to be part of the package. "She's not bothering anyone," he said quietly. Cameron's eyes narrowed slightly, a warning that Marcus recognized and chose to ignore. The dynamic between them had been shifting lately, ever since Marcus started dating Jennifer Walsh, a girl Cameron had unsuccessfully pursued the previous semester. The rejection still stung, though Cameron would never admit it publicly. "That's exactly the problem," Cameron said, standing with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being watched. "Someone needs to explain how things work around here. It's practically a public service." Across the cafeteria, Rebecca Chen sat with her camera crew from the school's media club. As the unofficial chronicler of Westfield Academy's social dynamics, she'd developed an instinct for recognizing when something newsworthy was about to unfold. The way Cameron was moving, the calculated casualness of his approach toward the new girls' table, all suggested drama was imminent. "Start recording," she whispered to her assistant editor, James Park. "Something's about to happen." James raised his phone discreetly, using a textbook as cover, while maintaining a clear angle on both Cameron's approach and Elena's table. Years of documenting school events had taught them that the most significant moments often came without warning, and being ready was half the battle. Elena sensed the approaching presence before she saw it, a shift in the ambient noise of the cafeteria that suggested attention being redirected. She'd learned to trust these instincts, honed through years of watching her mother assess threats in seemingly mundane situations. Without looking up from her book, she mentally catalogued exits, potential obstacles, and the number of steps to each escape route. "Interesting reading material." Cameron's voice came from directly above her, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as intoxicating to those susceptible to his charm. "Sun Tzu. A bit heavy for lunch break, don't you think?" Elena finished the sentence she was reading before looking up, a deliberate delay that she knew would irritate someone accustomed to immediate attention. When she did meet his gaze, her expression was carefully neutral. "I find it pairs well with turkey sandwiches," she said simply, then returned to her book. The dismissal was so unexpected that several nearby students actually gasped. At Westfield Academy, ignoring Cameron Ashford was tantamount to social suicide, yet this new girl seemed either unaware or unconcerned with the magnitude of her transgression. Cameron's smile tightened imperceptibly. He pulled out the chair across from her without invitation, the scrape of metal against tile deliberately loud. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Cameron Ashford. My family basically built this school." "How nice for them," Elena replied without looking up. "They must be very proud." The sarcasm was subtle but unmistakable. Derek and Marcus had followed Cameron over, maintaining their usual formation, close enough to provide support, but far enough to claim deniability if needed. Derek smirked at Elena's response, while Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable with the developing situation. "You know," Cameron continued, his tone shifting from friendly to instructional, "at a school like Westfield, certain traditions need to be maintained. Hierarchies exist for a reason. New students, especially scholarship students, typically show a bit more appreciation for being allowed into our community." The word "allowed" hung in the air like a poisoned dart. Elena finally closed her book, marking her place with a precise finger. When she looked up this time, there was something different in her expression, a hardness that seemed incongruous with her delicate features. "I wasn't aware that accepting an academic scholarship came with a requirement to genuflect before legacy students," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made several students lean forward to hear better. Perhaps you could point me to that section in the student handbook. Cameron's face flushed slightly, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. The handbook doesn't cover everything about how this place really works. Some lessons have to be learned through experience. Is that a threat? Eleanor asked, her tone conversational, as if inquiring about the weather. It's an observation, Cameron replied, leaning forward slightly. You sit here every day alone, acting like you're above everyone else. That kind of attitude tends to have consequences. Elena studied his face with the kind of intense focus her mother had used when interrogating suspects. She saw the insecurity beneath the arrogance, the fear of losing control that drove his need to dominate others. I'm sitting here reading a book and eating lunch. If that threatens you somehow, perhaps you should examine why. The psychological precision of the observation hit its mark. Cameron's hands clenched slightly, his knuckles whitening against the table's surface. Around them, the cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter as more students became aware of the confrontation. You think you're clever, Cameron said, his voice dropping to a more menacing register. But intelligence without social intelligence is just another form of stupidity. And trust me, you're about to learn that lesson the hard way. Before Elena could respond, Cameron's hand shot out and knocked her water bottle off the table. It hit the floor with a plastic crack, water spreading across the tiles in an expanding puddle. The gesture was calculated to provoke a reaction while maintaining plausible deniability. An accidentally knocked-over bottle being hard to prove as deliberate. Elena looked at the spreading water for a long moment, then back at Cameron. Pick it up, she said quietly. The demand was so unexpected that Cameron actually laughed. Excuse me. You knocked it over. Pick it up. Her voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm. You seem confused about how this works, Cameron said, standing now, using his height advantage to loom over her. I don't pick things up. People pick things up for me. Elena stood as well, slowly, deliberately. At 5'6", she was nearly a head shorter than Cameron, but something about her posture made the height difference seem irrelevant. Then today will be a new experience for you. The tension in the cafeteria had reached a breaking point. Students at nearby tables had stopped even pretending to eat, their attention fully focused on the unprecedented scene. Nobody challenged Cameron Ashford. It simply wasn't done. Yet this scholarship girl seemed immune to the social pressures that governed everyone else's behavior. Derek stepped forward, sensing his friend's growing anger. Cam, let's just go. She's not worth it. But Cameron was past the point of tactical retreat. His reputation, his entire sense of self, was built on never backing down, never losing face. No, I think our new friend needs a more direct lesson in respect. He reached out, intending to sweep her lunch off the table the same way he'd knocked over the water bottle. It was a move he'd used before, humiliating without being technically violent, the kind of thing administrative staff would dismiss as adolescent behavior rather than assault. But as his arms swept across the table, Elena moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural. Her left hand caught his wrist, while her right palm struck the back of his elbow, using his own momentum to redirect his motion. In a fluid sequence that took less than 2 seconds, Cameron found himself face down on the cafeteria table, his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that was both effective and surprisingly gentle. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work, drawn by the sudden cessation of normal cafeteria noise. Every eye in the room focused on the impossible sight of Cameron Ashford, untouchable golden boy of Westfield Academy, immobilized by someone half his size. As I said, Elena's voice carried clearly in the silence, pick up the water bottle. Cameron struggled against the hold, his face red with a combination of exertion and humiliation. Get off me! Do you have any idea what you've done? My father will have you expelled. My lawyers will destroy your family. Your father, Elena said thoughtfully, maintaining the hold without apparent effort. Richard Ashford, CEO of Ashford Pharmaceuticals, currently under federal investigation for price manipulation of insulin medication. I imagine he has bigger concerns than his son's bruised ego. The casual revelation of knowledge about Cameron's family situation sent murmurs through the watching crowd. This wasn't just physical dominance, it was informational warfare, and Elena had just revealed she'd done her homework. Marcus stepped forward, his athletic instincts overcoming his social conditioning. "Let him go," he said, though his tone was more request than demand. "This has gone far enough." Elena's eyes flicked to him, assessing. She saw something different in Marcus than in the others, a reluctant participant rather than an eager one. "I agree, but the question is whether your friend has learned anything from this experience." She released the hold and stepped back smoothly, maintaining her balance and positioning in case Cameron attempted retaliation. He pushed himself up from the table, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled, his uniform wrinkled, his composure shattered. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice cracking with rage. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." "Actually," a new voice interrupted, carrying the authority of age and position, "I believe that distinction belongs to you, Mr. Ashford." Vice Principal Harrison emerged from the crowd of students, her expression stern and unforgiving. A former Marine who'd transitioned to education after 20 years of service, she commanded respect through presence alone. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark suit gave her the appearance of someone who meant business. "I watched the entire incident," she continued, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Ashford, you initiated unwanted contact, destroyed property, and attempted assault. Miss Martinez defended herself with admirable restraint. She turned to address the wider audience. Everyone here is a witness to what actually occurred, and I trust you'll all be truthful if asked to provide statements." Cameron's face cycled through several emotions: disbelief, anger, and finally a cold calculation as he realized the extent of his miscalculation. "My father sits on the board of directors," he said, attempting to salvage some authority. "This won't stand." "Your father's position on the board doesn't grant you immunity from consequences," Vice Principal Harrison replied coolly. "In fact, it makes your behavior more egregious. You're supposed to be setting an example." She pulled out her phone and began typing. "Security footage from multiple angles will be reviewed. Mr. Park, I noticed you were recording. Please save that video and report to my office after lunch." James nodded quickly, understanding the gravity of the situation. His footage would become evidence in what was rapidly escalating from a cafeteria incident to a formal disciplinary matter. "Mr. Ashford, Mr. Huang, Mr. Thompson," the vice principal continued, "you'll all report to my office immediately. Miss Martinez, are you injured?" Elena shook her head. "No, ma'am. I'm fine. Nevertheless, you should visit the nurse's office for documentation purposes. When someone claims assault, even in self-defense, proper procedures must be followed." She surveyed the cafeteria with a stern gaze. "The rest of you, lunch continues as normal. Anyone spreading false information about this incident will face disciplinary action." As the crowd began to disperse, whispers erupting like small fires throughout the room, Elena found herself surrounded by a small group of students she'd never spoken to before. A girl with purple-streaked hair and paint-stained fingers stepped forward first. "That was incredible," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "I'm Sophie Chen. I've wanted to see someone put Cameron in his place for 3 years." Others nodded in agreement, sharing quick stories of their own encounters with Cameron's particular brand of torment. Elena listened with the same intense focus she'd applied to her book, cataloguing names, incidents, patterns of behavior that suggested this was far from an isolated problem. "He's been getting worse lately," a quiet boy with thick glasses added, "ever since his father's company started having legal troubles. It's like he needs to prove he's still in control of something." Elena processed this information, understanding now that her confrontation with Cameron was just the visible symptom of a deeper disease within the school's culture. The question was whether this single incident would lead to meaningful change or simply drive the problem underground. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You've made an enemy today. Cameron has connections you can't imagine. Watch your back." She showed the message to Sophie, who immediately took a screenshot. "We should document everything," Sophie said. "Cameron's network extends beyond the school. His father has connections in law enforcement, media, even some government offices. They're used to making problems disappear." Elena nodded, her mind already working through possibilities and contingencies. Her mother had taught her that bullies rarely operated alone. They created systems that protected their behavior while silencing their victims. Breaking one bully wasn't enough. You had to dismantle the entire structure that enabled them. As she gathered her belongings, careful to avoid the puddle of water still spreading across the floor, Elena noticed something interesting. Several students were openly recording now, their phones held high as they documented the aftermath. The age of silence and complicity was ending, replaced by something more transparent and potentially more just. Walking toward the nurse's office as instructed, Elena passed groups of students huddled in intense conversation. Fragments of dialogue reached her ears. Discussions about other incidents, other victims, other times when Cameron and his circle had crossed lines without consequences. The dam was breaking, and the flood of revelations that followed would reshape Westfield Academy in ways no one could yet predict. The nurse's office was a small, sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and latex gloves. The nurse, Mrs. Williams, was a kind woman in her 50s who'd seen enough to be surprised by very little. She examined Elena's hands and wrists, checking for any signs of injury from the altercation. "You handled yourself well out there," Mrs. Williams said quietly as she made notes in Elena's file. "Not many students would have stood up to Cameron Ashford." "Have there been others who tried?" Elena asked. Mrs. Williams paused in her writing, clearly weighing how much to say. "There have been incidents. Nothing officially documented, of course. Students who suddenly transferred, others who stopped coming to school, claiming illness. The pattern was there if you looked for it, but nobody wanted to look too closely." "Why not?" "The Ashford family donates millions to this school. They fund scholarships, including, ironically enough, yours. They pay for new buildings, equipment, programs that benefit hundreds of students. When you weigh that against a few incidents of bullying..." She trailed off, leaving the calculation unfinished. Elena understood. It was the same moral mathematics that allowed corruption to flourish in any institution. The greater good used as justification for individual suffering. Her mother had fought against the same mindset in the police force, the idea that certain criminals were too valuable to prosecute because of the information or resources they provided. "Things might be different now," Mrs. Williams continued, applying a bandage to a small scrape on Eleanor's palm that she hadn't even noticed. "Vice Principal Harrison is former military. She doesn't play political games the way her predecessor did, and with everything being recorded these days, it's harder to make incidents simply disappear." After leaving the nurse's office, Elena found herself in the quiet sanctuary of the library. She needed time to think, to process what had happened and what was likely to come next. The confrontation with Cameron was just the opening move in what would undoubtedly become a longer game. His threat that this wasn't over wasn't empty bravado, it was a promise. The library at Westfield Academy was a testament to old money and older values. 2 stories of leather-bound books, reading nooks with green-shaded lamps, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that suggested serious scholarship. Elena found an empty corner and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the messages that had been accumulating since the cafeteria incident. Most were from numbers she didn't recognize, students sharing their own stories or offering support. But one stood out, from a blocked number with no identifying information. Your mother was investigating something before she died. Cameron's father was connected. Be careful what you dig into. Elena's blood chilled. Her mother's death had been attributed to cancer, a long battle that she'd ultimately lost. But Detective Martinez had been investigating pharmaceutical companies before her diagnosis, looking into price-fixing schemes and contaminated drugs. The investigation had been shut down after her death, the files sealed, the case closed without resolution. The possibility that her mother's death might not have been natural causes but something more sinister had crossed Elena's mind before. But she'd dismissed it as grief-driven paranoia. Now, faced with this anonymous message, the possibility seemed less far-fetched. She pulled out her laptop and began researching, using skills her mother had taught her about following paper trails and connecting seemingly unrelated dots. Ashford Pharmaceuticals had a history of aggressive tactics against investigators and whistleblowers, lawsuits that disappeared, accusers who suddenly recanted, investigators who developed sudden health problems. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. And at the center of it all was Richard Ashford, Cameron's father, a man who'd built an empire on the suffering of others and would do anything to protect it. A shadow fell across her screen, and Elena looked up to find Marcus Thompson standing awkwardly nearby. Without his usual companions, he looked younger, less certain of himself. "Can I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from her. Eleanor nodded, closing her laptop, but keeping her hand on it, ready to leave if necessary. "I wanted to apologize," Marcus began, his voice low. "Not just for today, but for all the times I stood by and let Cameron hurt people. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I was just there for basketball. But that was just an excuse." "Why now?" Elena asked, genuinely curious. "What's different about today?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I guess seeing someone actually fight back made me realize how many times I could have done something but didn't. My girlfriend, Jennifer, she's been telling me for months that Cameron was toxic, that I needed to distance myself. But I was afraid of losing my spot on the team, my scholarship prospects, everything I'd worked for. And now I realize those things aren't worth having if they come at the cost of my integrity." He pulled out his phone and showed her a video. "This is from last month. Cameron and Derek cornering a freshman, making him do humiliating things for their entertainment. I recorded it, but never did anything with it. There are more. Dozens of incidents I witnessed or heard about." Eleanor studied the video, noting details that could be useful later. "Why didn't you report these before?" "Cameron's father has connections everywhere. The last student who tried to formally complain found drugs in his locker the next day. He was expelled within a week, his college prospects ruined. The message was clear. Don't cross the Ashfords." "But you're willing to cross them now?" Marcus nodded slowly. "What you did today, it showed that they're not invincible. And if we all stand together, if we all share what we know, maybe we can finally change things." They were interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps. Sophie Chen appeared, slightly out of breath, her phone clutched in her hand. "You need to see this," she said, showing them her screen. "Someone leaked the cafeteria video online. It's already got 10,000 views and climbing. The comments are insane, people from other schools sharing similar stories about Cameron and his friends. This is going viral." Elena watched the video, noting how the angle captured everything perfectly. Cameron's aggressive approach, his deliberate destruction of property, his attempted assault, and her measured response. The comments section was indeed explosive, with students from not just Westfield but other private schools in the area sharing their own experiences with entitled bullies protected by wealth and connections. "This changes things," Marcus said quietly. "Once something goes viral, even the Ashfords can't make it disappear completely." But Elena knew better. Public attention was a double-edged sword. It could provide protection through visibility, but it also painted a target on her back. The Ashfords hadn't built their empire by accepting defeat gracefully. They would retaliate, and when they did, it would be calculated and devastating. Her phone rang, displaying her father's number. She stepped away from the others to answer. "Elena, I just saw the video." Her father's voice was tight with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad. It was just a minor incident." "Minor? You took down the son of Richard Ashford. That's anything but minor. I'm coming to pick you up." "Dad, I need to stay. Leaving now would look like fear, and that would only empower them." There was a long pause before her father spoke again. "Your mother would be proud of you, but she'd also want me to keep you safe. The Ashfords are dangerous people. They've destroyed lives for far less than what happened today." "I know," Elena said softly, "but running isn't the answer. Mom taught me that bullies only have power if you give it to them, and I'm not giving Cameron or his father anything." After ending the call, Elena returned to find Sophie and Marcus deep in conversation with several other students who'd joined them. The group was diverse: artists, athletes, academics, and others who'd previously existed in separate spheres of the school's social ecosystem. "We're organizing," Sophie explained, "creating a network to document and share information about bullying and harassment at Westfield. If we all work together, we can protect each other and hold people accountable." Elena listened as they discussed strategies, noting both the enthusiasm and the naivety in their planning. They were thinking tactically when they needed to think strategically. Cameron's public humiliation was just the first battle in what would be a longer war. "You need to think bigger," she said, interrupting their planning. "Cameron is a symptom, not the disease. The real problem is the system that protects people like him. If you want lasting change, you need to target that system." "How?" Marcus asked. "Information is power," Eleanor replied, echoing one of her mother's favorite sayings. "The Ashfords maintain control through fear and secrecy. But secrets have a way of coming to light if you know where to look." She reopened her laptop and began showing them what she'd found. Financial records that suggested impropriety, connections between Ashford Pharmaceuticals and several board members' private businesses, patterns of intimidation that extended far beyond the school walls. "This is investigative journalism level stuff," Sophie said, impressed. "How do you know how to do all this?" "My mother was a detective," Elena said simply. "She taught me that the truth is always there if you're willing to look for it. The question is whether you're prepared for what you might find." As the afternoon wore on, more students joined their impromptu gathering. Each brought their own stories, their own evidence, their own pieces of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly clear. Westfield Academy wasn't just harboring a few bad actors. It was systematically enabling a culture of abuse that benefited the wealthy and powerful at the expense of everyone else. The sound of sirens in the distance drew their attention to the windows. Police cars were pulling into the school's parking lot, their lights flashing, but sirens now silent. Elena felt a chill of premonition. This wasn't a response to a simple school fight. This was something else. Vice Principal Harrison's voice came over the intercom, calm but urgent. "All students are to remain in their current locations. We are conducting a security sweep of the building. This is not a drill. Through the library windows, they could see officers entering the main building, some with dogs, others carrying equipment Elena recognized as drug detection devices. This was a raid, and she had no doubt who had orchestrated it. "They're looking for something to plant," Marcus said, understanding immediately. This is Cameron's father's playbook. When someone challenges them, they find or create evidence to destroy them. Elena quickly gathered her belongings, checking to ensure nothing had been added without her knowledge. Around her, other students were doing the same, the paranoia infectious and probably justified. Sophie's phone buzzed with a news alert. Local pharmaceutical executive's son attacked at prestigious private school. She read aloud. "The article makes it sound like you assaulted Cameron without provocation. They're already controlling the narrative." But Elena was already thinking 3 moves ahead. She pulled out her phone and began composing a message to Rebecca Chen, who'd been recording the incident from the beginning. "We need to release the full video with context," she said. "Not just the confrontation, but everything leading up to it. Every word Cameron said, every threat he made." Rebecca, who'd been quietly documenting everything from nearby, nodded and began uploading the complete footage to multiple platforms simultaneously. "I've got 3 different angles," she said, including audio that clearly captures him initiating contact and making threats. The police sweep continued for another hour, with officers methodically searching lockers, classrooms, and common areas. Several students were pulled aside for questioning, including Elena, though she noticed that Cameron and his immediate circle were conspicuously absent from the list of interviewees. The officer who questioned her was professional, but clearly uncomfortable with the situation. His questions were perfunctory, focusing more on whether she possessed any weapons or drugs than on the actual incident in the cafeteria. It was obvious he was going through the motions of an investigation that had been predetermined to find nothing significant. When the police finally left, having found nothing incriminating despite their thorough search, the atmosphere in the school had fundamentally changed. The failed attempt to frame someone had backfired, making Cameron and his father's tactics visible to everyone. Students who'd previously remained neutral were now actively discussing what they'd witnessed, and the recording of police searching innocent students' belongings was already circulating on social media. Vice Principal Harrison addressed the school over the intercom once more. "The security sweep has concluded with no prohibited items found. Classes will resume as normal tomorrow. Any student who feels they need to discuss today's events can schedule an appointment with the counseling staff." As students began to leave for the day, Elena found herself walking with an ever-growing group. What had started as a solitary lunch had evolved into something larger, a coalition of students united by their shared experience of standing up to institutional bullying. "This isn't over," Sophie said as they reached the parking lot. "Cameron's not going to just accept this. Neither is his father." Elena nodded, her mind already working through possible scenarios and responses. "No, it's not over." But something important happened today. People saw that standing up to bullies is possible. That's a powerful message. As she waited for her father to pick her up, Elena noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. It had been there when she arrived at school that morning, and it was still there now. She memorized the license plate, another habit inherited from her mother, and filed the information away for later consideration. Her father arrived in his old but well-maintained pickup truck, the contrast with the luxury vehicles filling the student parking lot, stark and unapologetic. As she climbed in, she saw him eyeing the black sedan with the watchfulness of someone who'd learned to recognize surveillance. "How bad is it?" he asked as they pulled away from the school. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Elena admitted. "But I think Mom would approve of what happened today." Her father smiled sadly. she would. She always said the only thing necessary for evil to triumph was for good people to do nothing. You definitely did something today. That evening, Elena sat in her small bedroom, laptop open, researching everything she could find about the Ashford family and their business empire. The more she dug, the more connections she found to her mother's old cases. Pharmaceutical companies that had been under investigation suddenly getting cleared, witnesses who changed their testimony, investigators who suffered unfortunate accidents or sudden illnesses. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. This time, instead of a threat, it was a link to a secure file-sharing site. The password was her mother's badge number, something only someone with inside knowledge would know. The files contained documents her mother had hidden before her death, a complete investigation into Ashford Pharmaceuticals that revealed price-fixing, contaminated drugs, and a pattern of eliminating threats through whatever means necessary. At the bottom of the file was a note in her mother's handwriting: "If something happens to me, make sure this sees the light of day." Elena stared at the screen, understanding now that her confrontation with Cameron wasn't random. It was fate, or perhaps her mother's investigation reaching out from beyond the grave to finally find justice. The question was whether she was strong enough to finish what her mother had started. The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, matching the subdued mood that had settled over Westfield Academy. Elena arrived early, partly to avoid the crowds and partly to scout the changed dynamics of the space. The black sedan was gone, replaced by a news van from a local station, its satellite dish extended like an antenna searching for scandal. Inside, the hallways buzzed with a different energy than usual. Students clustered in small groups, their conversations animated but cautious, as if they were aware that the walls might literally have ears. Several security guards had been added to the usual staff, their presence ostensibly for safety, but clearly also for intimidation. Elena made her way to her locker, finding a small crowd gathered nearby. They parted as she approached, some offering nods of support, others simply watching with curiosity. Her locker, when she opened it, contained a single white rose with a card that read, "Heroes don't last long at Westfield. A friend." She examined the rose carefully, noting the thorns had been removed and the stem cut with precision. It was both a warning and a message of support, the duality perfectly capturing the complex dynamics at play. "That's new," Sophie said, appearing beside her. "Usually they just leave threatening notes or dead things in people's lockers." "Progress," Elena said dryly, placing the rose carefully in her bag. "How's the network coming along?" "Better than expected. We have 43 students signed up already, with more joining every hour. Marcus has been incredible, getting the athletes on board. Turns out Cameron had been terrorizing underclassmen on multiple teams, forcing them to do his homework, run his errands, even cover for him when he broke training rules." The first period bell rang, sending students scurrying to their classes. Eleanor had advanced literature, a class she shared with Cameron, though she doubted he would attend given yesterday's events. She was wrong. He was already seated when she entered, his usual confident posture replaced by something harder, more dangerous. Miss Martinez, the teacher, Mr. Worthington, greeted her with unusual warmth. "I heard about yesterday's incident. I want you to know that this classroom is a safe space for all students." The declaration was unexpected and clearly directed at Cameron, who responded with a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. The class proceeded with artificial normalcy, everyone acutely aware of the tension between Elena and Cameron, but pretending not to notice. Halfway through the period, Cameron's phone vibrated. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted to one of satisfaction. He typed a quick response, then looked directly at Elena with an expression that promised retribution. After class, Elena checked her own phone to find dozens of notifications. Someone had posted edited versions of the cafeteria video that made it appear she had attacked Cameron without provocation. The editing was sophisticated, professional quality, the kind that required expensive software and considerable skill. "Don't worry," Rebecca said, appearing at her shoulder. "I've already posted the raw footage with timestamps proving the edited version is fake. The internet is good at spotting manipulated content, especially when the original is available for comparison. But the damage was already being done. The edited video was being shared by accounts with thousands of followers, many of them clearly bots designed to amplify the false narrative. It was information warfare, and the Ashfords had brought professional resources to what had started as a school conflict. During lunch, Eleanor chose the same table as the day before, a deliberate statement that she wouldn't be intimidated into hiding. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Sophie, Marcus, Rebecca, and a dozen other students joined her, creating a protective buffer against any attempted confrontation. "We've been thinking," Marcus said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Cameron's power comes from his father's money and influence. But that influence depends on maintaining a certain image. What if we could damage that image?" Elena considered this, thinking of the files her mother had left. It would have to be something undeniable, something that couldn't be spun or dismissed as teenage drama. "Like what?" Sophie asked. "Like evidence of criminal activity," Eleanor said quietly. "The kind that federal investigators would be interested in." The group exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of what she was suggesting. This was no longer about high school bullying. It was about taking on a powerful family with resources and connections that extended far beyond Westfield Academy. "That's dangerous," Rebecca said, her journalist instincts both excited and cautious. "The Ashfords have destroyed people for less." "They've already destroyed people," Elena countered, thinking of her mother. "The question is whether we're going to let them continue or fight back." The sound of approaching footsteps made them all tense, but it was only Vice Principal Harrison, her expression grave. "Miss Martinez, could you come with me, please? There's someone here to see you." Elena followed, aware of the worried looks from her new allies. The vice principal led her not to her office, but to a conference room where a woman in a dark suit waited. She had the bearing of law enforcement, the kind of quiet authority that came from years of dealing with dangerous people. "Miss Martinez," the woman said, standing and extending her hand. "I'm Agent Sarah Coleman, FBI. I understand you've had an interesting few days." Elena shook her hand, noting the firm grip and evaluating gaze. "I suppose that's one way to describe it." "I'm here because your recent altercation with Cameron Ashford has drawn attention to some ongoing investigations. We've been watching the Ashford family for some time, but we've struggled to find witnesses willing to testify. People tend to develop amnesia when the Ashfords are involved." "I can imagine," Elena said carefully, not yet ready to trust this unexpected ally. Agent Coleman studied her for a moment, then pulled out a photograph. It was Elena's mother, taken at what appeared to be a law enforcement conference. "I knew Detective Martinez. We worked together on several cases involving pharmaceutical fraud. Her death was suspicious, but we could never prove anything." Elena's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "Cancer isn't usually suspicious." "No, but the particular type of cancer, its rapid progression and the timing were all unusual. Your mother was getting close to something big, something that would have implicated several major players in the pharmaceutical industry." Agent Coleman paused, choosing her words carefully. "We believe she may have hidden evidence before her death. Evidence that could help us finish what she started." This was the moment of decision. Elena could play it safe, claim ignorance, and hope the Ashfords would eventually leave her alone. Or she could trust this agent and potentially expose not just Cameron's bullying, but his father's crimes. If such evidence existed, Elena said slowly, and if someone were to share it, what protections would be in place? Full witness protection if necessary, though I don't think it would come to that. The Ashfords are powerful, but they're not above the law, despite what they might believe. And with enough evidence, we can ensure they face justice. Elena thought of her mother, of the other victims of the Ashfords' cruelty, of the students at Westfield who lived in fear. I might know where to find what you're looking for, she said finally. But I'll need guarantees, not just for me, but for the other students who are willing to come forward about what's been happening at this school. Agent Coleman smiled, the expression transforming her stern features. I think we can arrange that. The Bureau has been looking for a way into the Ashford organization for years. Your mother started this investigation, Miss Martinez. It would be fitting if her daughter helped finish it. After the meeting with Agent Coleman, Elena returned to find the cafeteria in chaos. During her absence, Cameron had attempted to reassert his dominance, confronting the group that had gathered at her table. But this time, he'd miscalculated. The students stood together, refusing to be intimidated, and when he'd tried to get physical with Sophie, 3 different people had recorded it, while Marcus physically intervened. Cameron now sat in the principal's office while his father's lawyers argued with school administrators. The recordings were already online, showing clear assault and battery, making any defense difficult. The pattern of behavior was becoming undeniable, even to those who'd previously turned a blind eye. That evening, Elena met with Agent Coleman again, this time in a secure location away from the school. She provided copies of her mother's hidden files, watching as the agent's eyes widened at the scope of the evidence. This is enough to bring down not just Richard Ashford, but half his board of directors, Agent Coleman said, scrolling through financial records and witness statements. Your mother was incredibly thorough. She always said that in investigations, patience and persistence matter more than brilliance, Elena replied, feeling her mother's presence in the room. We'll need to move fast once we start arresting people. The Ashfords will try to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses the moment they realize what's happening. Are you prepared for things to get intense? Elena thought of Cameron's threats, of the black sedan that had been following her, of the edited videos and character assassination attempts. Things are already intense. At least now there will be a purpose to it. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Federal agents quietly interviewed students and staff at Westfield, building their case while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Cameron, perhaps sensing the walls closing in, became increasingly erratic. He showed up at Eleanor's house one evening, pounding on the door and screaming threats until neighbors called the police. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning, coordinated across multiple locations simultaneously. Richard Ashford was taken into custody at his office, his assets frozen, his computers seized. Several board members were arrested at their homes, their families watching in shock as federal agents led them away in handcuffs. At Westfield Academy, the news spread like wildfire. Students gathered in clusters, watching news feeds on their phones, barely able to believe what they were seeing. The untouchable Ashford empire was crumbling in real time, brought down by evidence gathered by a murdered detective and delivered by her teenage daughter. Cameron wasn't at school that day, but his absence spoke volumes. The power structure that had protected him was gone, replaced by legal consequences that no amount of money or influence could avoid. His enablers, Derek and others who'd participated in the bullying, found themselves suddenly isolated. Their protection evaporated. Vice Principal Harrison addressed the school in a special assembly, her tone both grave and hopeful. Recent events have exposed serious problems within our school culture, she said. We failed to protect vulnerable students, and we allowed wealth and privilege to excuse inexcusable behavior. That ends now. She announced new policies, including mandatory reporting of bullying, regular reviews of security footage, and an anonymous tip system that would be monitored by external counselors rather than school administrators. The changes were comprehensive, designed to prevent another Cameron Ashford from emerging. Eleanor found herself at the center of a transformation she'd never intended to lead. Students approached her throughout the day, some offering thanks, others sharing their own stories of overcoming bullying, many simply wanting to be part of the change that was sweeping through Westfield. "You've started something," Sophie said as they sat in the library after school. "Not just here, but everywhere. Other schools are implementing similar policies. Parents are demanding accountability. The hashtag #GreaterThanStandLikeElena is trending nationally." Eleanor felt uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on the practical outcomes rather than her role in achieving them. "It wasn't just me. Everyone who stood up, who shared their story, who refused to be silent anymore, they're the real heroes." Marcus approached their table, his expression serious. "I just got word from a friend. Cameron's been arrested. They found evidence he was involved in cyberbullying that led to a student's suicide attempt last year. He's being charged as an adult. The news should have felt like victory, but Elena only felt sad. Cameron was a product of his environment, raised to believe that power meant the right to hurt others. With different parents, different values, he might have been someone completely different. That evening, Elena visited her mother's grave for the first time since the confrontation began. She placed a white rose, similar to the one left in her locker, against the headstone. "We did it, Mom," she said quietly. "The Ashfords are facing justice. The school is changing. Your work mattered." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and for a moment Elena could almost imagine it was her mother's voice, telling her she was proud, warning her to stay vigilant, reminding her that the fight for justice never truly ends. As she walked back to her father's truck, Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Agent Coleman. "Richard Ashford is trying to make a deal. He's offering information on other pharmaceutical companies involved in similar schemes. Your mother's investigation is leading to something even bigger than we imagined." Elena smiled, thinking of the ripple effects that were still spreading from that moment in the cafeteria when she'd refused to be intimidated. One person standing up to a bully had exposed corruption that reached into corporate boardrooms and government offices. It was proof that individual courage could indeed change the world, one confrontation at a time. The weeks that followed brought a series of revelations that shocked even cynical observers. The investigation into Ashford Pharmaceuticals revealed a network of corruption that extended through multiple industries. CEOs were arrested, politicians were implicated, and a system of privilege and protection that had seemed invulnerable came crashing down. At Westfield Academy, the changes were more subtle but no less significant. The cafeteria, once a battlefield of social hierarchy, became simply a place to eat lunch. Students who'd never spoken to each other formed friendships across traditional boundaries. The culture of fear that had allowed bullying to flourish was replaced by one of mutual respect and accountability. Elena continued to sit at the same table, though now it was regularly filled with friends rather than emptiness. She still read during lunch, but the books were often interrupted by conversations about everything from homework to social justice to plans for the future. One afternoon, a freshman approached her table nervously. "You're Elena Martinez, right?" the girl asked. Elena nodded, marking her place in her book. "Yes. I just wanted to thank you. I was being bullied at my old school and I was terrified it would happen here too. But because of what you did, because of how things changed, I actually feel safe here." It was moments like these that made everything worthwhile. The threats, the surveillance, the attempts at character assassination, all of it faded in comparison to knowing that she'd helped create an environment where students could learn without fear. Rebecca Chen's documentary about the events, titled The Stand, premiered at the school's film festival. It included interviews with dozens of students, teachers, and even some parents, painting a picture of institutional change that went far beyond one confrontation in a cafeteria. "This isn't just about our school," Rebecca said during the Q&A after the screening. "This is about recognizing that bullying thrives in silence and secrecy. When we stand together, when we refuse to be bystanders, we can change entire cultures." The documentary went on to win several student film awards and was eventually picked up by a streaming service, spreading the message even further. Elena declined to participate in the publicity tour, preferring to focus on her studies and the quiet work of maintaining the changes they'd achieved. One evening, as she was studying in her room, her father knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," he said, his expression unreadable. Eleanor followed him to the living room, where she found a middle-aged woman waiting. She looked familiar, but Eleanor couldn't immediately place her. "Miss Martinez," the woman said, standing, "I'm Patricia Ashford, Cameron's mother." Eleanor tensed, ready for confrontation, but the woman's expression was sad rather than angry. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Patricia said quickly. "I'm here to apologize. I knew what my husband was doing, what he was teaching our son, and I did nothing to stop it. I told myself I was protecting Cameron by staying silent, but I was really just protecting myself." She pulled out an envelope and handed it to Eleanor. "This is a letter Cameron wrote. He's in a juvenile facility now, getting psychological help he should have received years ago. He wanted you to have this." Elena opened the envelope after Patricia left, finding a handwritten letter that was surprisingly introspective. Cameron admitted to his actions, acknowledged the pain he'd caused, and expressed something that might have been genuine remorse. He didn't ask for forgiveness, seeming to understand that wasn't his to request. The letter ended with a simple statement. "You were right. I was scared. Scared of not living up to my father's expectations, scared of showing weakness, scared of being anything other than what I thought I had to be. Thank you for stopping me before I became him completely." Elena folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where she kept important documents. Redemption was possible, even for those who seemed irredeemable, but it required acknowledging harm and working to change. Whether Cameron would follow through on his expressed intentions remained to be seen, but the fact that he was trying meant something. As the school year progressed, the changes at Westfield Academy solidified into new traditions. The anti-bullying network Sophie had started became an official school organization with funding and support from the administration. Marcus was elected captain of the basketball team and instituted a mentorship program, pairing older athletes with younger students who might be vulnerable to bullying. Elena found herself elected to student government, though she hadn't run for the position. Her classmates wrote her in, recognizing her as someone who would represent their interests, rather than perpetuate the old power structures. She accepted reluctantly, understanding that leadership sometimes chose you, rather than the other way around. At the first student government meeting she attended, the previous dynamics were immediately apparent. The positions had traditionally been held by the wealthy and connected, students who saw governance as practice for the corporate boards they'd eventually inherit. Elena's presence, along with several other newly elected outsiders, disrupted that comfortable arrangement. "We need to discuss the allocation of activity funds," the student body president, a senior named Charleston Webb, said, with the air of someone going through motions. "I propose we maintain the current distribution." Elena had reviewed the budget before the meeting, noting that the vast majority of funds went to activities that served a small percentage of students. "I'd like to propose a review of the allocation formula," she said. "Currently, 80% of funds go to programs that serve less than 20% of students. Those programs have traditionally received that funding," Charleston replied dismissively. "Tradition isn't justification for inequity," Elena countered. "We should fund programs based on participation and need, not on what's always been done." The debate that followed was heated but productive, ending with an agreement to survey the entire student body about their priorities. It was a small victory, but it represented exactly the kind of systemic change that was needed. After the meeting, Charleston approached her privately. "You know, making enemies of the established families at this school isn't wise," he said, his tone conversational but his message clear. "I thought we'd moved past threats," Elena replied calmly. "It's not a threat, just an observation. The Ashfords were one family. There are dozens of others with similar power and even less scruples about using it." Elena met his gaze steadily. "Then they should learn from the Ashfords' example. The days of ruling through fear and intimidation are ending. You can either be part of the change or be swept away by it." Charleston studied her for a moment, then smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." But even as new challenges emerged, the fundamental culture of the school had shifted. Students who would have previously suffered in silence now had support systems. Teachers who had looked the other way were now required to intervene. The administration, under Vice Principal Harrison's leadership, prioritized student safety over donor satisfaction. The black sedan that had followed Elena during the early days of the conflict never reappeared, though she occasionally noticed other signs of surveillance. Agent Coleman had warned her that making enemies of powerful people meant always looking over her shoulder, but Elena had accepted that as the price of justice. One afternoon, as she sat in her usual spot in the cafeteria, Elena reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The girl who'd arrived at Westfield Academy wanting only to read in peace had become a catalyst for transformation she'd never anticipated. "What are you thinking about?" Sophie asked, joining her at the table. "How small actions can have enormous consequences," Eleanor replied. "I just wanted to eat lunch and read my book. Now there are federal investigations, policy changes, and a completely different school culture." "The butterfly effect," Marcus added, sitting down with his tray, "except in this case, the butterfly knew martial arts." They laughed, the sound carrying across the cafeteria where dozens of similar conversations were happening. Groups that would never have existed before the transformation, friendships that crossed social and economic boundaries, discussions about things that mattered rather than just gossip and power plays. Rebecca arrived with her camera, as always, documenting the ongoing changes. "I'm working on a follow-up piece," she announced, 6 months later, examining what's actually changed versus what's just surface adjustment. "What's your conclusion so far?" Elena asked. "The change is real but fragile. It requires constant vigilance to maintain. The moment people stop paying attention, the old patterns try to reassert themselves." It was a sobering reminder that victory was never permanent. Every generation had to fight its own battles against injustice, had to stand up to its own bullies, had to insist on better systems than the ones they inherited. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Agent Coleman. "Thought you should know, Richard Ashford just pled guilty to multiple federal charges. He's looking at 20 years minimum. Your mother's work finally got the justice it deserved." She showed the message to her friends, who understood its significance. This wasn't just about teenage bullying anymore. It was about accountability at the highest levels of power. That evening, there was an impromptu celebration in the school parking lot. Students gathered to mark not just the conviction, but what it represented, the possibility that standing up to power could actually work. The gathering was diverse, including students who'd never have acknowledged each other's existence before recent events. Elena stood at the edge of the crowd, watching rather than participating. She'd never been comfortable with attention, preferring to observe and analyze rather than be observed and analyzed. But Sophie pulled her into the group, insisting she be part of the celebration she'd made possible. "This wouldn't have happened without you," Sophie said over the noise of the crowd. "It wouldn't have happened without all of us," Eleanor corrected. "I was just the spark. Everyone here is the fire." As the celebration continued into the evening, Elena noticed a figure standing apart from the crowd. It was Mr. Worthington, her literature teacher, watching with an expression of profound satisfaction. She approached him, curious about his thoughts. "In 30 years of teaching," he said without preamble, "I've watched countless acts of cruelty go unpunished, countless bullies graduate with honors while their victims struggled to survive. What you've done, what all of you have done, gives me hope that the next 30 years might be different." "Change is hard," Elena said, thinking of all the resistance they'd faced and would continue to face. "The worthwhile things always are," Mr. Worthington replied. "But that's what makes them worthwhile." As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor walked toward her father's truck, reflecting on the journey from that first confrontation in the cafeteria to this moment of collective triumph. The cost had been high: stress, threats, constant vigilance, but the rewards were visible in every interaction at school now. Her phone rang, displaying an unknown number. She answered cautiously, aware that not all unknown callers were friendly. "Miss Martinez," a cultured voice said, one she didn't recognize. "This is Senator Williams. I've been following your story with great interest. I'm working on federal anti-bullying legislation, and I'd like to discuss the possibility of you testifying before Congress about your experiences." Eleanor paused, understanding that this was another escalation, another level of involvement she hadn't anticipated, but she thought of all the students at schools across the country who faced what she'd faced, who needed systemic change at the federal level to protect them. "I'd be honored to help," she said finally. The conversation that followed outlined a new chapter in what had started as a simple desire to eat lunch in peace. Congressional testimony, national advocacy, the possibility of influencing policy that would affect millions of students. As she hung up, her father looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "You know, this means even more attention, even more scrutiny." "I know," Elena said, "but Mom always said that with privilege comes responsibility. The privilege of having a voice means the responsibility to use it for those who don't." The drive home was quiet, both of them processing the implications of this new development. The local battle had been won, but the war against institutional bullying was far from over, and Elena, whether she'd intended it or not, had become one of its generals. That night, she sat at her desk, looking at the photo of her mother that she kept there. Detective Maria Martinez smiled back at her, frozen in a moment of happiness before illness and potentially murder had taken her away. "I hope I'm making you proud," Eleanor whispered to the photo. "I hope I'm strong enough for what comes next." The photo, of course, didn't answer, but Elena felt her mother's presence anyway, in the skills she'd taught her, the values she'd instilled, the courage she'd modeled. The investigation that had cost Maria Martinez her life was finally bearing fruit, and her daughter was ensuring that her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Outside, the black sedan was back, parked at the corner where it could observe the house. Elena noticed it through her window and made note of the license plate. Different from before, but the surveillance style the same. Someone was still watching, still waiting, still hoping to find leverage or opportunity. But Elena wasn't the same frightened girl who'd first noticed the surveillance. She was battle-tested now, supported by a network of allies, protected by federal attention. The watchers could watch all they wanted. They'd find only a teenager doing homework, reading books, and occasionally changing the world. She returned to her desk and opened her laptop, beginning work on her testimony for Congress. The words came easily, flowing from experience and conviction. She wrote about Cameron and his transformation from bully to someone seeking redemption. She wrote about the systematic nature of bullying and how it required systematic solutions. She wrote about her mother and the investigation that had started it all. Hours passed without her noticing, the way they did when she was fully engaged in something meaningful. By the time she finished the first draft, it was past midnight, and the house was silent except for the hum of her laptop and the distant sound of her father's snoring. She saved the document and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The congressional testimony was scheduled for the following month, and she needed to be ready not just intellectually, but emotionally, for the scrutiny it would bring. As she drifted off to sleep, Elena thought about the ripples that were still spreading from that moment in the cafeteria. A pharmaceutical executive in prison, federal legislation being drafted, school policies changing nationwide, and countless students finding the courage to stand up for themselves. Her last conscious thought was of her mother, and how one person's courage could echo through time, inspiring others long after they were gone. Maria Martinez had started this fight, and her daughter would continue it as long as necessary. The congressional hearing took place on a crisp autumn morning in Washington, D.C. Elena sat at the witness table, facing a panel of senators who seemed either deeply interested or politically obligated to appear so. The room was packed with reporters, advocates, and other students who'd traveled to support her. "Miss Martinez," Senator Williams began, "can you tell us, in your own words, what happened at Westfield Academy and why federal intervention is necessary?" Elena leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "What happened at my school wasn't unique. It was a symptom of a disease that affects educational institutions across the country. When bullies are protected by wealth, connections, or institutional indifference, their victims suffer in silence. My case only got attention because it was filmed, because it went viral, because my mother left evidence of larger crimes. But for every story like mine that makes headlines, there are thousands that don't," she continued for 20 minutes, outlining not just her personal experience, but the systematic failures that enabled bullying. She presented statistics Sophie had helped her compile, testimonies from students across the country, and specific policy recommendations developed with input from educators and psychologists. The questioning that followed was intense, with some senators clearly sympathetic and others skeptical of federal involvement in what they saw as a local issue. Elena handled each question with the same calm precision she'd shown in the cafeteria, using facts and logic rather than emotion to make her case. "Some would argue," one senator said, "that this is simply kids being kids, that we're overreacting to normal adolescent behavior." "With respect, Senator," Elena replied, "there's nothing normal about systematic harassment, physical assault, or driving students to self-harm. What we dismiss as kids being kids can have lifelong consequences for victims. And in cases like mine, where bullying was used to cover up larger crimes, the stakes are even higher." The hearing lasted 3 hours, and by the end, even skeptical senators seemed moved by the testimony. The legislation that emerged from the hearing wasn't everything advocates had hoped for, but it was a start. Federal funding for anti-bullying programs, requirements for reporting and investigation, and protections for students who came forward. Elena returned to Westfield Academy to find herself something of a celebrity, though she deflected attention whenever possible. The school had continued to evolve in her absence, with new programs and policies taking root. The transformation was becoming permanent, embedded in the institution's culture rather than dependent on any individual's presence. Cameron's father's trial began that spring, a media spectacle that brought renewed attention to the case. Elena was called to testify, facing Richard Ashford across a courtroom where he could no longer hide behind wealth and influence. Her testimony was clinical, precise, focusing on facts rather than emotions. During cross-examination, Ashford's attorney tried to paint her as a vindictive teenager seeking attention, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Her mother's investigation, combined with the FBI's additional findings, created an airtight case. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. As Richard Ashford was led away in handcuffs, he looked at Elena with an expression she couldn't quite read. It might have been hatred, respect, or simply recognition that he'd been defeated by someone he'd never considered a threat. Outside the courthouse, Agent Coleman found her in the crowd of reporters and supporters. "Your mother would be incredibly proud," she said simply. "You finished what she started." "It's not finished," Elena replied, looking at the protesters who'd gathered to support the Ashfords, the signs calling her a liar and worse. "It never really is it?" "No," Agent Coleman agreed. "But each victory makes the next one a little easier. Each person who stands up makes it easier for the next person to do the same." The school year ended with a ceremony honoring students who'd made exceptional contributions to the community. Elena was among the honorees, though she tried to decline the recognition. Vice Principal Harrison insisted, arguing that visible recognition of courage was important for inspiring others. As she stood on stage, accepting an award she didn't feel she deserved, Eleanor looked out at the audience. She saw Sophie and Marcus and Rebecca, the core group that had stood with her from the beginning. She saw students she'd never spoken to, but who'd found courage in her example. She saw teachers who'd been reinvigorated by the changes in school culture. And in the back, almost hidden in shadows, she saw Cameron. He wasn't supposed to be there, technically banned from school property, but somehow he'd managed to attend. Their eyes met across the auditorium, and he nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement, apology, or simply recognition of what had transpired between them. Elena nodded back, then turned to face the future. High school would end, but the work she'd started would continue. There would be other bullies to face, other systems to challenge, other battles to fight. But she was ready for them now, armed with the knowledge that one person really could make a difference, that standing up to power was possible, and that courage was contagious. As the ceremony ended and students filed out into the bright afternoon sun, Elena felt a sense of completion mixed with anticipation. This chapter was ending, but the story was far from over. Somewhere, in schools across the country, other students were finding their voices, standing up to their tormentors, refusing to be silent. The ripples continued to spread, each one carrying the message that bullying wasn't inevitable, that power wasn't absolute, and that sometimes all it took was one person saying enough to change everything.